They laughed at my grandmother. They laughed because she lived in a peeling bungalow, because she clipped coupons as if frugality were performance, because she kept a cedar chest and a thrifted coat and hands that had been mended by work. They sipped wine in glass houses and traded barbs about taste, while she stitched buttons at the kitchen table. They never suspected the trust she left behind, and they never imagined how it would break every stained plaster illusion they'd built around themselves. What followed, county records, courtroom sessions that felt more like reckonings, and a Thanksgiving that the family would never forget, was the slow legal unthreading of decades of small cruelties. My grandmother was born in 1922. In 1943, at the age of 21, she lied about her age to enlist in the Army Nurse Corps. She went to war in a uniform and returned with a limp. She tended the wounded in theaters that were carved into history: Sicily in the summer of 1943, Operation Husky, Palermo falling in late July, and then the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Those dates anchor the kind of life she led, not a life of pageantry, but a life of service rendered on days that the world later called epical. She came back with the smell of antiseptic in her memory, with hands that bore the tiny accidents of tending, and with a habit of hiding cash in the hollow of that cedar chest. She kept receipts folded into letters. She wrote lists on grocery pads. She stitched on buttons and saved the nickels, and the family mistook thrift for deficiency. By 1967 she was widowed and working odd shifts at the VA. The bungalow's paint peeled, the porch leaned. In 1984 she taught me how to stitch a button while offering no lessons on which gown to wear to galas. Through the decades I heard the whispers at family dinners: why does she still have that mattress? Why is she always at the thrift store? The mockery hardened into a kind of default interpretation of her life: poverty as identity, thrift as shame. She wrote a will in 2003. After a hospital stay in 2009 that produced a brief bout of amnesia, she revisited her affairs and quietly updated that will with the help of a lawyer she trusted. She told me, in a voice that was almost a private prayer, "Keep the paperwork safe." The phrase felt like a command. When she died in 2016, the funeral room smelled of lilies and cheap perfume. Relatives calculated losses in glances. They swapped quiet strategies for expectation. Then, in late 2017, the county filings that followed her estate's administration revealed a number that stunned the people who had spent decades laughing at her thrift: $12 million. The funds had accumulated quietly: savvy investments, wartime and military pensions, rental houses she and my grandfather had owned but never discussed at Sunday dinners. The trust documents laid out an execution clause that was precise and, to the people who'd mocked her, brutal. Anyone who had actively belittled, abandoned, or attempted to manipulate her would inherit nothing. To me, whom she had called her first son in spirit, she left control and a mandate. That power shift was immediate and dramatic. Cousins who had sneered at her thrift found themselves reduced to petitioners, creditors, litigants. A Thanksgiving invitation twisted into a courtroom summons as contested wills and accusations of elder coercion surfaced. Old secrets came into the light: forged signatures, bank accounts looted with the ease of assumed entitlement, and a nephew who, depositions would later show, had been siphoning checks since 2010. County reporters ran a headline that made Aunt June faint: "Army nurse's quiet fortune triggers family firestorm." The headline landed like a match in a dry room. The family began to burn. The legal campaign that followed mapped, with grim clarity, decades of small cruelties. In 2019, depositions dragged us through every sentence we'd ever used to cut a woman down. I watched relatives who had once regarded my grandmother's thrift as a moral deficiency now beg for reconciliation with a sincerity that reeked of panic. They pleaded, staged contrition, and dispatched lawyers whose names were as polished as their reputations. They tried to reframe familial neglect as legitimate grievance. The trust, however, had been written with a stubbornness that matched my grandmother's. The execution clause was more than cold legalese. It was a moral instrument, an extension of her insistence that dignity be enforced. Faced with the choice of laying the evidence before the court or letting the narrative be shaped in back rooms and whispered calls, I made a decision that would define the next years of my life. I exposed the evidence. Not for spectacle, not for clicks. She had forbidden spectacle, but because she had trusted me to be the keel when the rest of the family revealed itself to be leeches. I delivered signatures, affidavits, A shoebox with a social worker's report, cancelled checks, intercepted voicemails, and a letter from the VA that showed certain bills had been mysteriously rerouted. I turned those documents over to the lawyer she had trusted and then, in a move that would widen the arena of accountability, I handed the transcripts to the county reporter who had been sniffing for a story. The fallout was kinetic. Privilege, once assumed, collapses quickly under the weight of public record. The nephew who had siphoned checks hired lawyers and tried to spin his actions as misunderstanding. But the paper trail, cancelled checks, forged endorsements, a ledger in his hand listing Mars meds alongside neat columns of zeros, was merciless. He settled in civil court with a restitution agreement, relinquished access to family accounts, and faded from social pages for a while. There was no criminal sentence. County precedent and prosecutorial priorities made that unlikely without a long, costly criminal trial. Humiliation, however, proved a punishment of its own sort. He avoided funerals and family gatherings for years. Thanksgiving the year after the filings was not Norman Rockwell. Cranberry sauce sat in bowls untouched. The house smelled of reheated shame. Where grace notes and prayers once punctuated the meal, subpoenas and motions did. One cousin, known for her snide remarks about thrift, stood to read a statement polished by her attorney. She was rehearsed and brittle. She read like an actress auditioning for contrition. I placed a transcript of her own text messages on the table, messages where she had referred to my grandmother as obsolete, and joked about erasing the mattress smell before weekend guests arrived. The room saw the years of small cruelties crystallize into undeniable culpability. It was a state of affairs made of weaponized paper. Courtroom days in 2019 were worse. Private lives were played out under oath. I watched a cousin who had once presided over salons choke on a sentence she had used to humiliate my grandmother. We thought living that way was a choice. Asked to repeat the line under oath, she did. The charisma vanished, the confession sounded brittle, an exhale of someone whose armor had been stripped. The defense raised questions about capacity and undue influence, but we had prepared. Nurses testified to lucidity. Letters in my grandmother's own hand, clear, precise, and consistent, were produced. There was a voicemail where she had said to me, plainly, "Keep the paperwork safe." That voicemail, short and emphatic, carried the weight of a life deliberately ordered. Public reaction bifurcated predictably. Social media fed on the collapse. Some relatives posted accusations and old voicemail snippets to sway public opinion. Others performed contrition on live streams, an immediate, performative sort of remorse by 2020. The trust, once activated, was used in the way she had intended, to renovate the underfunded VA waiting room in a neighboring town, to establish a scholarship for students in blue-collar nursing programs committed to veterans medicine, and to pay caretakers who had actually stayed with her in her final months. The humiliation that hit the mockers was satisfying in a narrow sense. It was also sobering. Karma, in this case, did not clap. It was the kind of bureaucratic, antiseptic labor that yields results without fanfare. The scholarship she stipulated, annual awards for students in blue-collar nursing programs who would commit to veterans medicine, put the first check into the hands of a young woman who had once worked nights at a bakery. When she accepted that award in a tiny auditorium, under a fluorescent light, her gratitude was quietly sacred. There were caretakers who deserved what the trust set aside for them. Rosa had spent the last months of my grandmother's life cleaning, feeding, and keeping vigil at 2 a.m. while relatives pleaded appointments and demands. She never asked for recognition. She asked me simply, "Please tell them it mattered." The trust left small nest eggs for Rosa and 2 others who had stood by my grandmother. When those checks cleared, one of the caretakers cried the uncomposed, animal cry of relief that can't be turned into a soundbite. Paying those people was not about social credit. It was about executing a promise made by a woman who stitched buttons and tucked away nickels to buy vitamins. That quiet fulfillment felt like the private victory she had wanted, a translation of thrift into dignity. The legal and social consequences continued to arc outward. A cousin who had spent decades as a realtor lost 3 listings in a week after a local online group connected old voicemails to his office. A niece who had decried thrift as lack of ambition lost a city council bid after activists used the documents to reveal hypocrisy. Opponents tried to recast the trust as an instrument of big idea philanthropy misapplied. They critiqued us from the vantage point of a theoretical philanthropy that would build palaces. They had not sat with a veteran who missed a pill because there was no bus fare. A consultant proposed an investment scheme promising spectacular returns while charging management fees that would have eaten into principal. The board rejected it. A developer named Alan Harrow appeared at a public meeting with a naming rights offer that smelled of polished publicity. We negotiated instead for practical services, a satellite clinic staffed by nurses who understood trauma. That was the kind of decision my grandmother's pen had been signaling all along. Not all wounds knit. Some relatives, those who had publicly argued for the sanctity of family legacy, gathered petitions and hosted meetings in church basements about rightful inheritance. They would not relent easily. Some refused to be part of the family again, others returned in small, guarded ways. The rule I set for myself was simple and unromantic: trust must be earned. Live-streamed apologies did not suffice. Genuine contrition required a rearranging of behavior and a small, tangible act of repair. Aunt June, who fainted when the story hit the press and who for years had believed honor could be preserved through decorum alone, ultimately made a donation to the VA renovation and volunteered at an outreach clinic. Her donation arrived with a press release that displayed her name prominently. Whether that act was hubris or hope, it mattered because she stayed, week after week, sitting with veterans while they cried and learning the names of medications and awkwardly at first and then with fierce competence, how to comfort someone who had been through trouble. The legal battles pressed on with a kind of bureaucratic thoroughness. Discovery pried open bank statements, emails, tax filings. A probate form from 2005 surfaced with an appendix altered by someone using a copier at a church. A neighbor testified he had seen the nephew carrying a stack of our grandmother's mail to his car late at night. The nephew's financial life, unpaid liens, patterns of cash transfers, a lifestyle that looked disproportionately flush next to his claims of dire need, was exposed. An email surfaced where he had forwarded a screenshot of my grandmother's thrift jar with the caption, "She's a hoarder, right?" He had meant it privately. He had not counted on discovery. In court, the nephew's defense narrowed to arithmetic and the small cruelty of entitlement. The judge asked why someone who had never shoveled a floor for the sake of a veteran should now claim stewardship of their care. His answers, personal, small, and vengeful, did not persuade. The judge's ruling, when it came, was clinical and decisive. The opinion respected the testator's intent. It found the documentation consistent and the will's provisions valid. The trust stood. Sanctions were assessed for frivolous claims. The relief of victory was not cinematic. There was no swelling orchestra, there was the slow, legal settling of accounts. But the ruling allowed the trust to begin functioning fully according to the woman who had, quietly and stubbornly, ordered her affairs. That legal vindication did not kindle a spontaneous, comfortable reunification of family. There were holidays with empty seats and social media rows that resumed like old habits. Some relatives remained estranged. Yet the community began to reshape itself. Veterans showed up at town council meetings in numbers that made old officials sit up and take notice. The renovated waiting room became less like a patchwork concession and more like a place where veterans could actually wait with dignity. A plaque was installed in the waiting room bearing her name and her years, 1922 to 2016. They used a hospital hat photograph for the plaque, a black and white image of a young nurse whose jaw was already set. People who had once sneered now walked past that plaque and found themselves without an answer. The plaque did not erase the past, but it redirected the future. Operational stewardship required a new kind of work. We formed a small independent board to oversee disbursements and governance. We put 3 people on it who had nothing to do with family: a retired VA doctor, a municipal clerk, and a pastor. They kept us honest. When a contractor attempted to bill for work not performed, the board sued in the trust's name and recovered funds. The day-to-day administration, processing modest grants, managing a shuttle program, securing a van lease for transportation to appointments, auditing invoices, was the unglamorous machinery that made mercy durable. Those were the quiet victories that did not trend but kept people alive. Small programs multiplied into modest and durable outcomes. The scholarship paid for a woman named Rosa, who had been a delivery driver and could not pass licensing exams because she had no childcare, to finish her nursing degree. We offered a childcare stipend, testing fees, and a pharmacology tutor, she graduated and later returned to the VA clinic as an RN. Billy, a man who had served 2 tours and come back with a violent suite of injuries and a criminal record, received transitional housing funds and therapy. He finished a GED at 42, and he now teaches a veterans woodworking program. Daniel, an apprentice who got a shop grant, parlayed his first commission into a union apprenticeship. These narratives were not sexy or sensational. They did not command airtime. They accrued quietly into the kinds of changes that matter most. There were tactical fights. A municipal health official wanted the trust to fund a glossy veterans gala that would funnel money into sponsorship packages and buffets. The board refused. We faced op-eds accusing us of pettiness and kicking the ladder away from the civic table. Those critiques missed the point. Dignity was not a shapeable commodity to be parceled out for endorsements. We refused to turn the trust into a publicity engine for local officials or for consultants who packaged philanthropy into conference talks and PowerPoints. It is an ugly truth that the economy of influence in small-town politics often offers compromise only at the cost of the thing you intended to protect. We chose, repeatedly, to defend the purpose my grandmother had written down. The public narrative hardened into caricature at times. Podcasts turned the family drama into a morality play. TV segments, eager for spectacle, zeroed in on the guilty relatives like a game show. The internet reflected every angle with a cruelty that is difficult to watch. Strangers resurrected private arguments, conflated accountability with spectacle, stitched together novels from fragments of our lives. There were death threats. There were messages of gratitude. The exposure had an unpredictable appetite. Still, the ledger, the receipts, the invoices, the bus passes paid for, became a more persuasive narrative than gossip ever could. There were personal costs that money could not amend. The satisfaction of accountability curdled at times into melancholy. Some relatives begged for privacy when the press had already done its work. The lawyer my grandmother trusted feared that the family would splinter irreparably. At first she resisted releasing transcripts to the press. But my grandmother had been precise. There would be no legacy to people who attacked her dignity. She had chosen law as the mechanism for preserving that dignity. Her pen was a gavel, and she trusted it to be enforced. People assumed that the humiliation of the mockers would heal me. It did not. For a while, triumph tasted hot and righteous. Then it cooled into a recurring ache. The rooms became quieter, not warmer. I apologized to neighbors whose secrets had been aired. I apologized to caretakers whose gratitude held its own weight. I apologized to my grandmother in gestures, by funding the clinic, by supporting the scholarship, by defending her intent, because there was no longer an opportunity for words at a bedside. There were instances of real repair. Aunt June, after her fainting episode and public panic, eventually took on clinic volunteer work in earnest. She came without fanfare and sat with veterans. She learned names of meds and how to make coffee for someone who had trouble sleeping. She donated funds, she volunteered, and she persisted long enough to be recognized as useful rather than merely performative. That steady presence changed the way some people remembered her. Whether that was forgiveness or partial rehabilitation depends on the observer. The point was that she chose labor over performance, and that mattered. There were also people who never wanted the shoebox opened. They begged me to let the lid be slammed and to fold their names back into privacy. I understood their plea. I had felt it. The lawyer my grandmother had trusted had warned us that the public airing risked splintering the family. But my grandmother had chosen the law, precise and stark, to enforce dignity. To close the lid would have been to return the power to the people who had used it as a cudgel. I honored her choice. 2 winters after the trust began operating in earnest, the town's patterns had changed enough that the VA bench dedication felt like the right moment to gather survivors of a kind. A bench was installed in the park, a modest municipal gesture. Its inscription read, simply, "For those who serve and for those who keep them safe." The bench used the hospital hat photograph from my grandmother's volunteer years. On the anniversary, a line of veterans read the names of scholarship recipients. A delivery driver turned RN accepted applause. A veteran's woodworking teacher grinned at his apprentices. A nephew who had once tried to confiscate everything sent flowers he could ill afford. Aunt June wept openly. The leader of the council, who had once sniffed at thrift, came and gave a guarded apology. The ceremony was low-key and honest in the way small towns can be when they stumble toward decency. There was no gloss, no press release meant for national consumption. There was simply the ordinary, necessary work of naming what mattered. The trust matured into an organism that learned muscle and memory. We hired staff, younger and less battle-scarred, who built an application that was simple and kind. They taught the board to think in terms of outcomes rather than optics. We fought a contractor who tried to bill for work not performed. We renegotiated van leases and audited invoices until they were lean. We set up a legal clinic for veterans facing predatory landlords. We funded a mechanic who would make house calls so veterans could keep appointments. We spent money on tiny, inexpensive things: a bus pass, a pack of diabetic socks, an emergency heater repair, that made lives possible. Not every critic evaporated. A former board member accused me, in a voicemail that still tightens my jaw, of playing at pious poverty and using my grandmother's name to build a profile. He left. He became a small, persistent voice in op-eds. Those are the inevitable costs of stewardship: enemies who will try to discredit the work because they think the work threatens their narrative. I learned to keep meticulous records and to let some accusations pass like rain. There were days when I wondered whether a quieter intervention a decade earlier, one cross-table conversation, a family meeting, might have prevented the public unthreading. But the default posture of the family had been derision for so long that the only language they understood was legal. They used shame as currency. They collected it. To let that pattern determine inheritance would have been a different cruelty entirely. Slowly, the town began to exhibit a different vocabulary around service. Civic debates turned pragmatic. A shuttle service for clinic appointments launched. Volunteers staffed a legal clinic. High school vocational tracks picked up woodworking and trades. The city council began, haltingly, to ask better questions. When a developer offered a naming rights endowment that would have sought durable visibility, we declined in favor of services that worked where people lived. Buildings make good monuments, services save lives. There were human reversals. The nephew resurfaced, thinner and repentant in a way that was at once sincere and self-serving. He came to the bungalow's kitchen table, handed me a paper bag with 2 cans of coffee, and asked how the scholarship application worked. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked to be useful. It may have been penance. It may have been the first honest question he'd asked in years. He left a little lighter. Whether that lightness held is another chapter. Some people are changed by law, some by work, some by neither. The trust's small victories multiplied, often unnoticed. A veteran barber reopened his shop with a new chair purchased by a grant. A paramedic who had lost her job in an accident used an emergency subsidy to avoid eviction and retrained. A man finished a GED in his 40s and now teaches a shop class that employs veterans. Those stories did not trend. They accrued. They were the quiet ledger entries of dignity. There were moments when the press did not help. Podcasts and TV shows smoothed nuance into narrative, packaged our family into a morality play. The internet, always hungry for spectacle, dredged up old arguments and turned private grievances into public theater. Yet every time the theatrics surged, another invoice arrived in our mail: $57 for dental work, $250 for heater repair, $600 for a month's rent to stave off eviction. Those small checks told a more useful story. The trial, the hearings, the depositions, those procedural instruments left records that could be read as sour medicine or as necessary antiseptic. In the margins of that litigation I found a drawer of letters my grandmother had written. Drafts she had saved in the bungalow, pages she intended to make public only if her intentions were challenged. They were not angry, they were precise, sometimes wry. If they call me cruel for choosing the small over their pomp, then let that be my epitaph, she wrote. To me she had written, do not let me be shrunk to an episode. Be stubborn. Be kind. I read those lines aloud in a closed courtroom when the tempest of litigation began to wane. The judge, who would rule for us, heard a voice that had been deliberate. The legal resolution loosened grudges but did not produce reunion. People learn slowly. Earnest apologies, when they come, are often partial. The niece who once wrote sermons on family honor, sent a casserole with an attached essay on restitution that managed to be both condescending and performative. Acceptance, when it arrived, came in fragments. Over time, the trust became a machine that could be trusted to make small, relentless choices: fund a nurse navigator, pay for a bus pass, cover testing fees for an aspiring RN, support a man through therapy and rent until he could get back on his feet. There were daily ethics to be exercised: a refusal to fund glossy galas for the sake of optics, an insistence on modesty over monuments, a willingness to say no to proposals that would funnel money into influence. Those decisions hardened the character of the trust. They were not cruel, they were a refusal to let sentiment be used as currency. The public narrative softened into something like grudging admiration. A persistent journalist named Tessa came back to write not about the sensational family drama but about the ledger, about bus passes, sneakers, a small van lease. She documented the receipts and the results. Those pieces shifted the conversation in town from ridicule to recognition. The relatives who had sought to shut the lid found their snobbery on record. Apologies began to arrive, rarely whole but more frequent. The community, slow as a tide, began to change its language about service. There were smaller, human reckonings. A neighbor who had scorned my grandmother's coupons sent a note saying, simply, that seeing veterans lined up at the new clinic had made him ashamed of his old jibes. That is not spectacular. It is a quiet admission. Sometimes the work of stewardship is to create enough small, tangible good that embarrassment can convert into action. When I walk past the VA waiting room now, when I sit on the park bench inscribed with her name and dates, 1922 to 2016, I think not so much of victory as of obligation. The trust does not absolve me of loneliness or regret. It made me unpopular in some circles. It made me necessary in others. It required decisions that cost friendships and tested my patience. It asked me to be lonely for the work. I accepted that. If there is a final lesson, it is this: dignity is not an ornament, it is a practice. My grandmother's money did not sanctify anyone. It forced choices. It made our family confront what we had been: people who conflated shame with superiority, and it reoriented resources to improve lives. To hand dignity to the undeserving is to reenact cruelty. To enforce a person's last wishes when they were made with deliberation is fidelity. She left me a ledger and a list of names and a clause that read like a dare: not for those who made me small. She wrote that when she had the strength to name what mattered. I do not claim perfection in how I executed her will. I botched things. I made strategic errors. There were times when I used the press and it stung people in ways that did not heal. There were nights when I wondered whether I had been right to expose family failings to the light of public record. But the alternatives, the quiet, storied inheritance of people who weaponized shame, were worse. When dignity is under threat, sometimes law and publicity are the only tools that will enforce it. Walking past the bench on a clear morning, watching a veteran argue politics with a much younger man, seeing a nurse on her lunch break reading a journal, I feel that the principle my grandmother spelled into law has had its intended effect. Dignity travels best when it is kept in circulation: paid bus fare for a clinic appointment, the scholarship that paid for a nursing degree, the repair that kept a man in treatment. Those small things do the heavy lifting. They do not make headlines. They make lives. So, if you find yourself standing over a shoebox of papers, or holding the last handwritten instructions of someone who tended others more than themselves, remember this: power inherited must be translated into honest use. Defense of the weak sometimes requires legal forms. Protect the caretakers first. Speak plainly. Use the instruments given you, pen, paper, and the law, when they are meant to preserve dignity. Be willing to be lonely for the work. Better to be unpopular and faithful to a person's intent than complicit in a cruelty that dresses itself as legacy. In the end, the people who had once sat in glass houses and laughed at a peeling bungalow learned, in a very public way, that thrift can hide power. They learned that wealth without moral worth is brittle and that paper can be as sharp as any knife. My grandmother taught me that embarrassment is a currency she spent so her dignity would belong to the next generation. She refused to let cruelty inherit her name. She gave everything to the people who had stayed and nothing to the people who had made her small. That was the equilibrium she intended, and it is the one I kept. 2017 arrived with the quiet, stubborn business of turning paper into practice. The trust, funded with the $12 million my grandmother left, became an institutional problem as much as it was an ethical one. We could have availed ourselves of consultants and built a glossy bureaucracy to burn through headlines. Instead, we set up a lean operational model, a small board, a rotating advisory committee of veterans and clinicians, and a part-time administrator whose primary qualification was patience. We wrote policy in plain English. We codified what my grandmother had written into a value statement that began, simply, with dignity before display. The litigation that had shadowed the first year settled enough to allow full implementation. The judge's ruling, delivered in late 2017, upheld the terms of the trust and affirmed the standing of its stewardship clause. That ruling did not close wounds, it cleared a legal path. By the spring of 2018, we had our first cohort of grants. We paid for a shuttle van, $42,000 for a rugged, used minibus and modifications so wheelchairs could roll, and we underwrote a 2-year nurse navigator position with a $105,000 commitment. We awarded 15 small stipends that summer, averaging $600 apiece, for people who needed short-term help to remain in treatment or training. Those small expenditures added up. In 2018, we logged 1,234 transactions under $500. The accounting looked unglamorous: grocery cards, bus passes, a welding kit for a returning veteran who wanted to teach a class. It was painstaking, and it required policies to prevent mission drift. Do we fund a gala for a partner that, in turn, would give us more visibility? No. Do we support a tiny, underfunded app that will coordinate volunteer rides to clinic appointments? Yes, if the app runs without collecting personal data and if it reaches people who are otherwise isolated. The trust also had to answer larger questions. How much principal could we reasonably distribute without risking the corpus over the decades my grandmother intended it to last? We consulted financial advisors, but the ultimate guardrail came from the values she had printed in the margin of a will: not to outlive usefulness, not to be used for vanity. We chose a conservative distribution strategy, roughly 4 to 4.5% annually of the market value, so that the trust could make meaningful grants while retaining longevity. That number meant sacrifices: fewer capital projects, fewer big checks. It also meant stability across market cycles. Then came 2020. The pandemic reframed everything. Overnight, the needs multiplied. Clinics shifted to telehealth, isolation intensified mental health crises, and veterans, already at risk, found the social structures on which they relied unraveled. The trust moved rapidly. In March of 2020, we declared an emergency protocol and released a one-time fund of $250,000 to support eviction prevention, food security, and telehealth access. We doubled subsidies for transportation to essential appointments, even when clinics were closed. We funded tablets and data plans for veterans whose physical immobility had always been a barrier to care. The $12 million corpus, invested in a diversified portfolio, took a hit like every other portfolio, but it held, largely because the conservative distribution rate had created a buffer. That year also exposed the limits of quiet work. A national podcast picked up our story and, like earlier media, prefaced the nuts and bolts with the family drama, which sold more ads. The former board member resurfaced in commentary, now with a different tenor. He accused the trust of elitism for refusing large, one-off donations from conglomerates that included naming opportunities. He accused me of truncating family history, of weaponizing a late-life pen. Platformed by internet rage, his voice amplified. That cacophony could have distracted us. Instead, it forced the trust into a posture of even greater transparency. We released quarterly reports, held open forums, and published anonymized case studies so readers could see not just the sums but the human outcomes. The pushback faded not because critics were silenced, but because the ledger made an argument that was harder to deny: lives had been stabilized. There were vexations. When we tried to extend a multi-year vocational training partnership to a neighboring county, it collided with a well-financed nonprofit that claimed philosophical ownership of veteran workforce development. We were sued again, this time by an organization that alleged we had overstepped our charter by supporting out-of-county residents. That suit was narrower than the first, but came at a moment when funds were under stress. The suit was resolved in mediation in 2021, We agreed to prioritize our immediate geographic mandate but to partner on regional initiatives that offered reciprocal benefits. We learned, in those negotiations, how law could be a bridge as well as a fence. People asked for metrics. How many veterans had the trust helped? How many nurses were trained? Those were blunt questions for a project grounded in incrementalism, but they mattered. By the end of 2021 we could say that, since inception, the Trust had directly funded over 3,200 discrete supports, clinical copays, bus passes, credentialing fees. We had provided scholarships to 30 nursing students, 12 of whom graduated and 3 of whom returned to work in our town's clinic. We had granted 40 small capital purchases, workbenches, dental chairs, a refrigeration unit for a clinic pharmacy. Items that rarely inspire press but keep clinics running. Those numbers were never the point in themselves. They were a means to show that the $12 million was not a piggy bank for prestige but a pump for care. By 2022, the town's institutions began to adapt. The school district expanded vocational tracks. The county health department added a coordinator for veteran services, someone whose salary had once been a proposal we had to agonize over. Local philanthropy started to emulate our practice of small, sustained grants. The civic language shifted further from contempt to curiosity. Some of my relatives returned to the table, in small, tentative ways. The nephew who had handed me 2 cans of coffee reappeared intermittently with volunteer hours at the clinic. He spoke about stocking shelves and sweeping floors. The niece who had sent the sermon with the casserole called a few times to ask, genuinely, about setting up a monthly town hall on elder poverty. Those overtures were partial. They were not redemption narratives so much as evidence that people's public positions can erode when confronted with recurring human need. We were not immune to human error. A mid-2022 grant to a startup that promised to coordinate rides fell short. The organization mismanaged funds and delivered fewer rides than promised. We cut ties, initiated recovery of funds, and reallocated money to a smaller, grassroots volunteer program that performed better precisely because it was rooted in local relationships. The mistake cost us time and reputation. It taught the team to vet community partners not just for business plans but for local embeddedness. Externally, the arc of the scandalmongers bent toward another lesson about thrift and power. An investigative series in the regional paper, Tessa's pieces matured into a multi-part series by then, traced a web of local donors who had used philanthropic gestures to influence zoning and policy. The series contrasted those donations with the Trust's deliberate refusal to fund influence campaigns. The pieces did not sanctify us, they contextualized. Readers could see, in black and white, how the Trust's modest expenditures, an $800 repair here, a $3,000 training scholarship there, mattered more in the long run than a $200,000 naming gift that bent a council's priorities. Public opinion didn't flip on a dime, but the pendulum swung farther from derision toward respect. Inside the Trust, succession planning became urgent. I had not expected stewardship to require the creation of a cadre of people who could hold on to the same stubborn modesty. We set term limits for board members, prioritized veterans and frontline workers in advisory roles, and instituted mentorships so the institutional memory wasn't just in my head. In 2023 we hired a managing director who had been a social worker in rural clinics and who knew how to juggle spreadsheets and empathy. My role shifted from administrator to guardian of principle. I traveled less and sat in more meetings where the central debate was not whether to fund a program but whether that program honored the idea that dignity should be portable and immediate. There were moments of symbolic closure and symbolic outrage. At the 5th anniversary of my grandmother's death, in 2021, a modest ceremony at the park bench included 3 veterans, an RN who had been a scholarship recipient, a teenage apprentice from the shop class, and a county commissioner who admitted she had been wrong in an earlier vote that favored an upscale developer over affordable housing. The audience was small and the speeches shorter than expected. My grandmother's epitaph, "Not for those who made me small," was read by a woman whose life the Trust had quietly steadied. That moment mattered because what my grandmother had done in law was reinforced by what the community did on the ground. Not everyone ever forgave. The niece who had written sermons published a memoir in 2022 that recycled old grievances and portrayed the Trust as a family war of attrition. The memoir sold copies and occupied opinion pages. We did not litigate her words, instead we continued to publish our records. Time, more than any editorial, eroded the fury. When public praise turned up in op-eds written by former skeptics, I assumed those were transactional apologies. Instead, they revealed a subtler change. People had begun to redefine the local meaning of service. By 2024, the Trust began to think about legacy beyond annual distributions. What would it mean to ensure the infrastructure of care existed without our direct action? We piloted a model to sequester a portion of the annual distribution into capital projects that would be operated by community partners. That meant preserving a clinic's dental chair with a small endowment to cover maintenance for a decade, or underwriting a scholarship fund that would be matched by the community college. These were modest innovations, $150,000 set aside here, a $75,000 matching pool there, but they created leverage. The approach reduced our transactional load and catalyzed local investment. Conversations about scale returned. Could a principle-driven trust scale beyond a single town? We hosted regional convenings in 2023 and 2024 to share what we had learned, prioritize small, repeatable supports, center people with lived experience on advisory boards, enforce structural modesty in grants to avoid perverse incentives. Delegations from other municipal and philanthropic outfits visited. Some left with plans to replicate the model, others were less patient, preferring the spectacle of big projects. Replication proved harder than replicationists thought. It required cultural change as much as money. There were also private reckonings. I kept reading my grandmother's letters. They remained an atlas for decisions. In one undated note she had written, "Money magnifies what you are, not what you pretend to be." I would return to that line when critics accused us of piety or when the temptation to expand into grander projects tugged at our ambitions. The Trust's conservatism was not timidity, it was a deliberate refusal to let money substitute for relationships and to make aid contingent on gratitude or spectacle. By the end of 2024, the ledger was thick. We had weathered lawsuits, a pandemic, and at least 2 public smear campaigns. We had also catalyzed a modest civic shift, a commuter shuttle for clinic visits, a trades pathway in the high school that now employed 2 veterans as instructors, and a steady stream of small grants that kept people in treatment and training. The Trust had become less a personal instrument and more a civic agent. Its $12 million was now an operational fact of the town's landscape. Looking forward into 2025, the Trust prepared its first decadal review. We commissioned an independent evaluator to assess impact, not to sell a story but to learn, which interventions scaled, which were brittle, how did the Trust's choices alter trajectories of service in the region. The preliminary findings were instructive. The evaluator praised the Trust's focus on immediate, tangible aid and recommended scaling up the scholarship match program. They also cautioned against mission creep. As the Trust's visibility grew, so did the number of proposals that muddied intention with spectacle. I do not know the end of this story, nor do I believe there is an intended finality to stewardship. The Trust's work is, by design, iterative. It requires maintenance, of funds, of principles, of relationships. There will be more disputes, more op-eds, more attempts by those who resent the rearrangement of an old hierarchy to reclaim narrative power. There will also be veterans who, 10 years from now, recount that a bus pass mattered more than a speech, nurses who credit a small scholarship with changing the arc of their careers, shop teachers who hire students who were otherwise invisible. Those outcomes are not grandiose. They are durable in the way that a repaired heater is durable. It does not make headlines, but it keeps a body warm. I accept still that the Trust's work requires a certain loneliness. I accept that in defending the specifics of my grandmother's will I severed some attachments that might otherwise have congealed into an easier inheritance. I do not regret that choice. The $12 million in the Trust was a tool that could have smoothed the family's pride or could be used, as it has been used, to buy the unglamorous necessities of dignity. For now, the Trust's accounts close each quarter with small expenditures and small miracles. Bus fares paid, tests passed, a GED completed, a dental appointment kept. The work continues, unglamorous and stubborn, toward a future in which my grandmother's last, insistently practical generosity keeps turning paper into real life. In the months after the preliminary decadal review in early 2025, we treated the evaluator's findings as both an inventory and an instruction. The report, released in full in June 2025, was as measured as the evaluator herself. It praised the trust for privileging immediacy and argued that our small, repeatable supports had a cumulative effect that larger, less frequent philanthropy often missed. It recommended scaling the scholarship match program and protecting the trust from what it called mission creep and prestige capture. It also offered a sobering note: without intentional transfer of institutional knowledge and steady attention to administrative detail, the trust could begin to drift toward the very spectacle it was avoiding. The language was clinical, the conclusions humane, and the board accepted it with the same mixture of relief and anxiety that had marked much of our stewardship. We set about implementing the recommendations in the second half of 2025. The board voted to formalize the scholarship matching mechanism as a 3-year pilot, committing a modest but predictable portion of the annual distribution to seed matches at the community college and the local vocational program. Those matches would operate under rules that mirrored the trust's ethos. The college had to provide career counseling and a short mentorship pairing for each recipient, and the vocational program had to demonstrate a pipeline to actual paid work. The $75,000 matching pool we had used experimentally in 2024 was not abandoned. Instead, it became the baseline for the new program, bundled with a new set of expectations and a requirement that the community match contributions by at least 25%. We framed this as mutual obligation, not leverage. If the community would add its part, the trust would multiply the effect at relatively low cost. At the same moment, we tightened governance. The term limits passed in 2024 were enacted in 2025 with the first scheduled rotation of 2 board members: a labor nurse who had been on the board since the trust's inception and a local small business owner. We added 2 new advisors with lived experience, a former VA case manager and a carpenter who had run apprenticeships with at-risk youth. The managing director we had hired in 2023 remained, and her steadiness turned out to be the best gift the trust could have received. She refined our grant application templates, insisted on quarterly narrative reports in plain language, and resisted the allure of quarterly headlines. The trust's public profile continued to attract scrutiny. Tessa's series in the regional paper had been a watershed, and by mid-2025 she had pivoted to examine local government's responsibilities in partnering with philanthropy. Her pieces continued to differentiate between donors who sought to convert gifts into policy levers and donors, like my grandmother's trust, that insisted on not buying influence. Those articles widened the public debate, and while some critics remained suspicious, many others began to see the difference between a 100-seat auditorium named after a one-time donor and a 5-year pipeline of bus passes that kept people in treatment. That rhetorical shift mattered. It did not erase the past hostility my family had shown the trust. It changed the frame by which the town judged civic giving. Internally, we tested other innovations. In late 2025 we launched an oral history initiative, hiring a part-time archivist to record the lived experiences behind our metrics. Nurses who had received small scholarships, veterans who used clinic services, apprentices who had been hired out of shop class. The recordings were not polished PR. They were messy, candid human accounts that we catalogued and made available to community partners. My grandmother's letters remained a touchstone, especially the one that said, "Money magnifies what you are, not what you pretend to be." In the archive, that sentence became a founding principle for anyone who worked for the trust. We insisted that grantee partners conduct small, regular focus groups. We asked them to share stories with us, not as proof of impact but as counsel for future decisions. 2026 brought both progress and a new set of tests. The scholarship match program, expanded in January, produced its first cohort of matched students by August. The evaluator's prediction, that small, consistent support paired with local accountability produced tangible outcomes, found some affirmation. The initial cohort showed higher persistence in their chosen programs and, by the fall, 2 of the matched apprentices had been offered paid positions at local firms that had partnered with the vocational school. These outcomes were not viral. They did not command front-page space. They were, however, the sort of durable changes we had sought. The town's high school reported that enrollment in shop classes rose by a modest but steady percentage in 2026, and the county credited the trust's seed funding with helping the school hire 2 veteran instructors, continuing a pattern that had begun in 2023. Not all experiments succeeded. In mid-2026, we contracted with a regional nonprofit to pilot an aggressive outreach program for homebound seniors. The nonprofit had a strong reputation elsewhere, But in our context it prioritized scale over local partnerships and spent months trying to impose a centralized model that overlooked neighborhood-level realities. By November the board had to intervene, redirect the funds, and terminate the contract. The managing director negotiated a recovery plan and used the experience to refine our vetting process. No out-of-town applicant could receive more than $25,000 in initial seed funds without a local partner letter and a compulsory 8-week immersion in the community. The failure stung, but it also honed the trust's instincts about what counted as competence in small-town contexts. Family relations advanced and frayed in equal measure. The nephew who had once handed me 2 cans of coffee became a steady volunteer in 2026. He organized a monthly clinic cleanup day and began to recruit his high school friends for the program. The niece who had once sent the sermon and the casserole led several town halls about elder poverty in early 2026. Tentative, genuinely curious, and sometimes uncomfortable. Her tone had shifted from admonition to inquiry. She did not stop accusing the family of moral failure in private conversations, but in public she began to convene. The memoir she had published in 2022 continued to circulate, but its edges softened as more people experienced the trust's on-the-ground work. Some relatives remained distant. Others, like the nephew, chose to participate in practical ways rather than in familial reconciliation. The trust's legal posture, too, evolved. A small lawsuit in late 2024 had tested the spirit of my grandmother's will. An elderly relative claimed undue influence, and by mid-2026 the case had been conclusively dismissed. The dismissal did not feel like a victory so much as a confirmation. The trust had been created with clear, enforceable directives, and those directives were being followed. The legal victory, however, did produce a political effect. Critics who had trafficked in insinuation had fewer hooks. That reduced the frequency of public smear campaigns but did not eliminate them. By 2027, the trust began to think in triennial cycles rather than annual bursts. We instituted 3-year grants for organizations that demonstrated both impact and adaptability, and we increased the portion of funds sequestered for capital maintenance. In effect, rolling more of the $150,000 capital strategy into a conservative maintenance model that would preserve clinic equipment and infrastructure for longer. That move took some courage. The temptation to fund a new center or to give a one-time large gift never fully receded. But the managing director and the board were able to point to the simple arithmetic of regular maintenance. A well-kept dental chair produces dozens of patient visits over a decade. A flashy facility without maintenance produces fewer returns. Local policy began to shift in response. A county commissioner who had previously favored upscale development over housing for lower-income residents publicly acknowledged her earlier error in 2021. By 2027, she sponsored an ordinance that created a small fund for rental assistance for elderly residents on fixed incomes. The trust did not lobby for the ordinance. It simply provided data and testimony from grantees that illuminated the human cost of inaction. The political shift was slow and contested, but the fact that municipal leadership began to legislate incremental protections indicated that civic priorities had in some measure been reshaped. We continued to encounter the social limits of money. In 2028, a winter storm tested the town's resilience, and the trust found itself funding emergency generator repairs and coordinating volunteer runs for elderly residents. The money bought diesel and paid for overtime. It did not solve the underlying infrastructure deficits. Those deficits required larger-scale public investments and policy choices beyond what a $12 million trust could supply. We recognized this and worked more actively to build coalitions with county and state agencies. The trust's role was to catalyze and to stabilize, not to substitute for government responsibility. By 2029, discussions about succession and endowment stewardship grew more practical. The board completed a 10-year financial policy that kept the principal intact and prescribed a modest draw rate designed to ensure intergenerational stability. We adopted a conservative investment policy with an eye toward inflation and interest rate volatility, and we created an emergency liquidity reserve that could be tapped during sudden crises like the 2028 storm. None of these moves solved the emotional questions that had opened when my grandmother's will was read. They answered the technical ones that future stewards would ask. The trust's story also became a resource for others. Delegations continued to visit, and a small network of like-minded donors coalesced by 2030. Some sought to emulate our modest, principle-driven approach. Others were less concerned with modesty and more with branding. We learned repeatedly that models cannot be transplanted wholesale because the underlying cultural work is what takes the longest. Philanthropy is a mirror of the community it enters. If a town values spectacle above sustenance, spectacle will grow. If a town values the steady work of dignity, steady work becomes possible. We began to offer not a template but a set of questions for would-be replicators. Whose voices are centered? How do you keep administrative hunger from outpacing actual service? What is the smallest intervention that changes an outcome? Personal rituals continued to root the work. In 2026 we placed my grandmother's bench under a newly planted maple tree by the clinic. An act few would call ceremonial but which felt like the right kind of fidelity. At the bench we sometimes held short gatherings. People who had been helped, people who had helped, and people who were still skeptical. One autumn afternoon in 2029 a veteran who had once been homeless sat on the bench and told a group of teenagers how a bus pass had let him get to a job interview that led to steady work. He spoke quietly, without a sense that he owed the listeners a story. It was enough that the bench had borne witness. There were also quieter, slower ripples. By 2030 some of the apprentices who had been supported by the Trust's scholarships had begun to hire new apprentices themselves. A local clinic that had once teetered now planned a modest expansion funded by state grants that had been easier to obtain because the Trust's matching funds had already demonstrated local commitment. The nephew remained a steady volunteer. The niece continued to host town halls that were less sermon and more conversation. We still published our records. We still received occasional op-eds from distant critics. But the day-to-day work, the bus fares paid, the tests passed, the GEDs completed, the dental appointments kept, accumulated into a quiet civic competence. I continued to read my grandmother's correspondence. An undated note that had once seemed merely pithy. Money magnifies what you are, not what you pretend to be, became, decade after decade, a test we applied to our decisions. When the board debated a proposal that promised visibility, we asked whether that visibility would improve people's lives in ways that would be visible a year from now, 5 years from now. We insisted that dignity be replicable and portable. A diagnostic appointment covered by a bus pass in 2025 should still be a diagnostic appointment covered by a bus pass in 2030, not a photo opportunity. I do not pretend that the Trust solved structural inequality, nor that it made all family grievances disappear. There are people who still resent the redistribution implicit in my grandmother's will. There are familial fault lines I have learned to accept as permanent. But there is also a town in which small public acts, dental cleanings, apprenticeship stipends, a repaired refrigeration unit for a clinic pharmacy, have altered life trajectories in ways that public speeches rarely do. The Trust's stewardship required the hard work of translation, turning a bequest into practices that the town could sustain and that would not be co-opted by prestige. Looking toward the next decade, the Trust prepares for the steady tasks of stewardship, maintaining the physical infrastructure it has helped preserve, ensuring the scholarship matches continue to connect to paid work, protecting the small maintenance funds from being absorbed by the siren calls of large one-time projects. We will continue to rotate board members, deepen our local roots, and insist that any expansion of scale be matched by commitments to local accountability. We will also keep the oral history archive, because stories refine metrics and because dignity sometimes needs a voice to make it real. I accept that this path will always demand a measured loneliness, defense of a will that some relatives called petty and an insistence on modesty in a culture that elevates spectacle. I accept, too, that the Trust's $12 million is both an instrument and a test, an endowment that magnifies whatever tendencies we bring to it. My grandmother's trust will endure or falter depending on how faithfully future stewards remember the smallness of the things that mattered: a repaired heater, a bus pass, a dental appointment kept. Those things do not make headlines, but they keep people warm, moving, and present. The story of the Trust is not cinematic. It is procedural, iterative, and stubbornly human, and the work continues toward a future in which those small interventions add up to something that outlives any one of us.